appreciate you coming over today so I can tell you a bit about my campaign. So I'm running for Congress in the 10th District. I'm doing a primary challenge to Patrick McHenry. The main reason I'm involved in Congress in this run is because I see our country failing. It's failing our students, it's failing our citizens. We talk about education a bit. I look at the statistics coming out of our public schools, or as I like to call them, our government schools, and more than 50% of our children are failing. In fact, there was a Pew Research article that they looked at our students' performance in international competitions, and the proficiency level of our high school seniors in mathematics was 22%. That means almost 4 out of 5 of our students were not proficient in math when they graduated high school. It was under 50% for reading. It means more than half of our high school graduates nationwide are not proficient in reading.
Is it nationally?
Nationally.
Yeah, jeez.
And our founding fathers told us you can't have a republic without an educated public. When we look back at the U.S. Department of Education, when it was created in 1979, our students were involved in those competitions at that time, and they routinely placed 1, 2, or 3 internationally against developed nations in reading, math, science. When you look at today's results, they're 28, 29, 30, or worse down the list in performance with developed nations. So I see the U.S. Department of Education as a total failure. We take a bunch of money from all the taxpayers, we send it up to D.C., D.C. takes their cut, and then parses it back out to the states along with a whole bunch of mandates that do nothing to actually educate our children. So that's one of my objectives, is to fix education in this country, return it back to the states, back to local government where it was intended to be all the time. And the second part of that then is an initiative that I've started in the state of North Carolina. At this year's GOP convention, I was a delegate and led a floor fight to change our party's platform. Successfully led that floor fight. And what I asked for to be amended was to add language that says that it is our party's position that all monies distributed by the state for the purpose of education K through 12 follow the student to the education choice of the parent, be it public, private, or charter. In so doing, you put competition into the education system. And I don't care where you look across society, when you add competition, it improves the product.
You're talking about school choice, attaching the money to the kids so that you can naturally open it up and parents can, you kind of create almost a marketplace for education instead of having it be, hey, here's your high school, here's where you go, this is run by the state government or whatever, and you kind of have no options, right? So that system would create the options to...
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, charter schools has helped some, but there's so few. There's waiting lists at virtually all the charter schools for parents to get in. But imagine as a parent, you and 15 other parents. Now let's talk about that for a minute. The amount that the state sends is about 70% of what's actually spent on students. That's state taxes, the education lottery, and what they get from the federal government that then is distributed based on a per pupil count. Mm-hmm. The individual counties also supply about 30% of the school budgets in each county. Mm-hmm. About. So if we look at North Carolina right now, that's about $9,500 per student that is spent on education. So imagine now if we take 70%, so we're talking $6,500 or a little bit more than that. Now imagine you and 15 parents get together, and you've got a good teacher identified, and you all say, we want you to take our students as a private instructor. There's 15 of them. Mm-hmm. Now that teacher suddenly is getting 15 times $6,500.
Right. It's an actual business. You can actually.
She or he is opening a private school.
Yeah.
It's still meeting the requirements. Mm-hmm. You have an educated person to conduct the training, and all of a sudden they're getting $90,000 or more. Well, I hear them all the time complaining about what they get. I'm doubling or tripling your income. Now, obviously, there's expenses. You have to have a place to do that. You have to have materials. But I guarantee you, that type of system, if we get that implemented in law, and two of our state representatives, one congressman, one senator, has agreed to work with me on legislation for that. But you get that in place, private schools will pop up. It's opportunity.
Well, it's already happening now, right? There's a huge, even in the past, 5, 10, I remember even 15 years ago when a lot of the charter schools started popping up. Mecklenburg County, they come in here in Lincoln County. I see that more and more in a lot of kind of specialized education where, it's almost like classical education where maybe not a school, but there's training in some type of certain skill,
sure.
The Montessori schools and things like that. So there seems to me to be that, there's already that kind of that desire in the market, right? There's a market for it. It's just about, is the state government, the federal government that's keeping that from, letting people do that?
Well, it's because that you have the government school system is so developed, and the vast majority of teachers across this nation, because of state work laws or other issues, belong to these unions, and these unions have, this is what our priorities are and how you'll do things, and you have all this stuff coming into government. The CRT is just the most recent example. Mm-hmm. But I think, this COVID shutdown, if you will, really opened the eyes of a lot of parents what's going on. And I was at an event with our Lieutenant Governor, Mark Robinson, here a couple of weeks ago. And according to the numbers he relayed to us, there's been a 10% decline year over year of the number of students attending the government schools, and instead that's gone to homeschooling. Parents have found out what's going on in the classroom, and they're disgusted. So there's a whole number of things that are all coming together at one time that make this the opportune time to shift that issue on education. So that's one of my big priorities.
So is that an issue that has to be kind of dealt with at the federal level, or can the state? I mean, I'm sure there's probably different ways to deal with it, but in your opinion, is that something just the state? North Carolina would come together, the state representatives, maybe the governor with it, could kind of solve that issue for North Carolina, or does that have to be done, in Congress and at the federal level?
It has to be done at both.
Both.
So first of all, we have to have action at the federal level to get rid of the Department of Education, to get rid of all the mandates that they put down. And of course, they're distributing dollars to the states. They're getting that from the general taxes that they take in. Mm-hmm. So, for one state to simply say, well, we're not going to follow the U.S. Department of Education any longer, we're just going to go our own way, they're going to lose a huge chunk of education dollars. So now the parents are still paying those taxes, but they're getting nothing in return for it.
Because of how that's set up already, yeah.
So
all the money goes to the federal government, comes back, they grant it back. Which is one issue probably, right? That's probably a core issue. Okay. Yeah.
And anytime they're granting that money back, there's always strings attached. The government doesn't give you anything without strings attached to it. So that's one of the big issues that caused me to get in this race is we've got to fix education if we want to continue to have a free republic. And you look every day, you see things happening. One of the most egregious things that we saw recently was earlier this year during the Virginia elections, the run-up to the Virginia elections, with all the parents going to the school boards and raising issues because of what they're now seeing that they're over the computers with their children doing that distant learning.
Right.
We had the national government, the federal government, Department of Justice, we're going to go after parents as domestic terrorists for raising their voices at school board meetings. What happened to the First Amendment here? Parents definitely have a say and should have a say in their children's education.
Seems like that shouldn't even be like that's kind of like not even a question, right? Like, should we debate that? I don't think we should even debate that, right?
Well, but yet we saw in one of the last debates between the former governor of Virginia and Youngkin, the new governor of Virginia, you had the former government stand right up and say that the parents should have no say in the education of their children.
Yeah.
It's just bizarre.
So the federal part of that equation, of getting either completely getting rid of the Department of Education or reforming it or whatever, that's going to require obviously other representatives from other states, and it would have to be a lot of them, a majority somehow, to kind of figure that out, right?
Well, I think first of all, copy the Constitution right there. The Constitution starts off and tells us what is the federal government's responsibility, and then it turns around and says, and everything else belongs to the states or to the people. How do we get this done? I will tell you how I get this done in Congress. I will pledge right now that I will not vote for any funding bill from the government that funds the U.S. Department of Education at more than 20% less than it is currently funded. And each year, it's going to drop by another 20% until we get rid of the Department of Education, or it's not going to get my vote. And I'm going to bet you that I can get 20 other Republican congressmen, congresswomen on board with that mentality. I would bet I could get 40 or 50 more on board with that mentality. And you go to the leadership, we already know that there's a partisan divide on every bill that goes forward, so each side of the aisle is relying on their own members to get things moved. You get a major portion of the delegation says, we're not going to fund that. We're not going to approve your bill unless you get rid of that funding. Something's going to have to give.
Right.
And I think I can get together a coalition big enough to make that happen.
Do you have your eyes on certain people? I don't know if you do or not, but eyes on kind of certain people who would be your allies, either from North Carolina or other states to do that, to kind of get that done? Because that's probably the hard part. I always thought being in Congress would be frustrating because there's what,
435 in the House, yeah.
Right, so you have to work together with large groups of people.
Yep.
In this bureaucracy that's a tangled mess, right? And you've got all these issues, and you probably very, very understand that probably difficult to understand even the landscape until you're in it. But I wonder if there's certain people you kind of have in mind. I'm not looking for names. I'm just kind of...
There are people that I already have my eye on from things that they've said and positions that they've taken on that issue and other issues. So there are people that I have in mind. And I'm not going up to D.C. with a whole load of things that I'm after. I'm really, as I tell people out on the stump, if you will, there's three things that I'm going to promise them. I'm not going to vote for any bill that has subsidies in it. All subsidies is government's taking money from one person and giving it to another because they prefer one person's business or technology over another's.
Mm-hmm.
The corn subsidies because we prefer to have ethanol. Well, if ethanol was better for us, you wouldn't need to have subsidies. People would buy it willingly, but yet you have to have subsidies to get people to manufacture it because it costs more. We have right now all the green energy, the wind farms and the solar farms, and we have federal subsidies for those. Why do we have subsidies for those? Federal government and state government. Because they're not economically efficient and people don't want it. The only way that they can make it viable is by taking tax money from the citizens and giving it to somebody else.
The people that argue for subsidies and like government involvement of it, I think just have this is kind of just a difference of kind of viewpoint of almost like what government should do in general, right? Like, oh, you should gather together the people's funds and kind of invest almost like a hedge fund or something like that, or like an investment or a Y Combinator, right? And kind of put money into the things that we believe should be helpful for everybody or will be good investments down the future, right? That's kind of the argument for subsidies, right?
Well, no, the subsidies is, look at the left. The left has decided that CO2 is a bad gas, and if we don't reduce CO2, we're all going to die. The planet's going to die. Well, that tree out the window can't grow without CO2. It dies without it. CO2 is not a poison. Man-made global warming is a myth, in my opinion, in all the research that I've read. But you have an agenda driven internationally on that topic, and you'll notice it went from first we if you go back to when I was in school and in the early years out, we were going into another ice age because of all this.
It was the ice age, right?
Yeah, and then it became here about a little over a decade ago, it became global warming. So now we went from ice age, now we're going to overheat. And actually, if you look at it today, it's not global warming any longer. It's climate change. Well, I'm here to tell you, the climate has been changing for 5 billion years on this planet. It's going to continue to change. We've had ice ages, we've had a variety of different climates, and it will continue to change, and man is a small part of that. But with that, we said, well, we've got to have all this green energy. Well, if green energy is really what we need, and that's what people want, why do we have to subsidize it? If that's what the people want, they would pay for it. But the only way we can get people to manufacture it and put it in place is to subsidize them with tax dollars. And it really gets worse than that. I was a supervisor at Duke Energy, and I can recall shortly after the merger having a meeting with management, and all of us from our department in there with the senior executive. And he was talking about this and how it affects the everyday consumer. So you have these federal subsidies to put in this wind farm. So there's tax dollars going to subsidize that because it's not economically competitive. Then you have state subsidies going in to put in these wind farms and these solar farms. Once again, we're subsidizing it with tax dollars. The taxpayers paying for this, whether they're getting any benefit from it or not. Now let's take it one step further. Because of state regulations and because of shareholder initiatives, Duke Energy was paying subsidies to these people to put in their wind and solar farms. It buys goodwill. But there's a catch.
Yeah.
Put all this in, and then Duke had to turn around and pay these same folks not to produce electricity with these solar farms or these wind farms they just put in. Because if they did, then Duke Energy would have to take off their base load plants. And as soon as the sun went behind the clouds or the wind stopped blowing, now they're not getting that energy from those solar farms or those wind farms. We have blackouts or brownouts, even if they're short duration, it takes time to spin up those baseload plants. And now Duke Energy gets fined because there were brownouts or blackouts. So now the utility customer is paying more to these people to not operate the farms that they subsidized in the first place.
On top of already, essentially, right, it's your money that's going into this whole system in the first place, right? Through
Exactly.
taxes or whatever else to kind of pick and choose. Then, right, people in Congress or in different departments are kind of making these decisions. And then you've got all these kind of unpredictable byproducts of those types of policies, right?
Right.
Like you're talking about. So you've seen that firsthand.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So your philosophy, and I think your website, which I think is great, and it's like really, it's very good about explaining, which by the way, I asked everybody needs to know that you wrote it. So it's Speer for Congress, right?
SpeerForCongress.com.
Okay,
Yes.
yeah. So you wrote what's on the website, which I thought was impressive too. Like I told you, most political campaign websites, I think, don't very clearly or just aren't great about communicating exactly what it is that they want to do, or you can just tell that you have a talent for written communication. Not everybody has that. That's one thing I noticed from your website. But it was very clear to me that your campaign is very, what you want to do is almost it's simple, or you want to simplify government and kind of push away. Your concept is that the government should not be involved in picking and choosing and subsidizing and all that, but stepping back and letting people the freedom to do that, whatever that might be.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to the Constitution there. When I read through it, in the very first opening, it talks about purpose. And it says, to establish justice. Well, that certainly to me seems to indicate we need a Justice Department. A few words further on, it talks about to provide for the common defense. That suggests to me a Defense Department, whatever we call it. If I go further into Article 1, then back in Section 8, I believe it's Section 8, we start talking about some of the responsibilities of Congress. And one of the first ones we get to is, of course, taxing. And then we get to coining money and punishing counterfeiting, establishing weights and measures. That sounds like, to me, a Department of Treasury. We have several clauses that follow that talk about defense, and then we get to one that talks about commerce and their responsibility with commerce. Okay, so we now pick up a fourth Department of Commerce. We also talk about taking care of federal properties. The federal district, which we call the District of Columbia today, we have forts and bases and what have you around the country. We have federal national parks, and sounds like a Department of Interior to me. And then I don't see anything else that adds on to that until I get over to Article 2, Section 2, and we start talking about the president appointing ambassadors and such, and negotiating treaties with other countries. That sounds like a Department of State to me. So as I read this thing, I come up with 6 federal departments that are clearly enunciated what the federal government's responsibility is. And with a little bit further reading, it says in there that everything else is reserved to the states or the people, respectively. So there's just a ton of things that the federal government is doing that it has no business doing. And all it has done with every one of those things is create more bureaucracy, more problems. It hasn't solved anything. Federal government hasn't solved hunger. It hasn't solved homelessness. It hasn't solved, take your pick. So we need to get the federal government out of the things they don't belong involved in.
What's, I think a lot of people agree with that. Like you said, they have, federal government hasn't solved hunger, hasn't solved all these issues that have kind of been, sold to the people over time that, hey, if we do this, we're going to solve this, right? And so we've got this, 200-300 years now of a mess. If you subscribe to what you're talking about, right, that, hey, we've got all these departments and all this kind of layers and layers of government, how do you, sitting now, 2022, how do we even fix that? How do you even begin to fix that?
Well, I'm glad you asked that. But I am going to correct one thing a little bit, because up until the 1900s, we only had 6 federal departments. Now, there was a couple of pieces of things that they were doing that they ought not to have been doing according to the Constitution, but we only had 6 federal departments. And it was under President Wilson that we really had this professional government come up, and then between Wilson and Roosevelt and Johnson, we had the mass growth of government and all these new federal departments. So how do we correct that? Well, here's a fact of life. 3 things, and I provided you a couple documents on a balanced budget and term limits, and I'm working on a 3rd one. I know what the end result is. It's really easy to spell what the end result of that constitutional amendment is. It's writing it in such a way that it's actually implementable. So reducing government, which is a great question that you had. We have about 7 federal departments, full departments that need to go away, and about 70 separate independent commissions, agencies, administrations, commissions that also need to go away. Now, some of those simply need to be in part rolled into the 6 remaining federal departments. But let's take Department of Education, for example. Earlier on, I said over a period of years, I said 20% reduction in the budget each year. States have become reliant on those federal education dollars. If you were to just take and overnight get rid of the Department of Education, suddenly the states would be saddled with millions and millions, billions of dollars,
right,
new spending that they don't have a revenue stream in place to cover. So it's got to be worked in over a period of time. Now, it can't be decades. It needs to be a reasonably short period of time, reasonably short number of years. But that becomes the complication on writing an amendment to cover all of those different organizations. How do you reduce their scope to eventually eliminating them at a pace that is within the capability of the states to absorb that new responsibility, or that responsibility back, that funding? So it gives the states time to adjust their taxation process, but at the same time, federal taxes need to go down. So and that's the difficulty in providing the language for that amendment, because the amendment really, you can't just say when this amendment is passed by the states, or that suddenly tomorrow all these things go away. It just,
right. It'd be nice, but not realistic. Yeah.
It has to be scheduled in. So 3 things Congress will never do. Congress will never enact term limits for themselves. Congress will never enact a balanced budget amendment.
Yeah.
Congress will never enact an amendment to reduce the size and scope of government.
Yeah.
All 3 of those lead to the reduction of the power of Congress, and they're not going to vote on anything that reduces their power.
So about term limits, and I was talking about, you said that the government became very professional like 100 years ago, and just wondered your thoughts on that. A lot of people see people go to Congress and they go and they stay there, and that's like, they think of it as a career, and not just Congress but anywhere else. They treat it as a career, which seems odd. That that it be a profession, right? And that you have like a salary and all this stuff, and a like a retirement package and all these benefits and things like that. It just seems kind of counterintuitive. I think a lot of people on the outside see that and they're like, wait, what? They feel a little bit more cheated than I think they might every other day.
So that's a great question, and I gave you a copy earlier of draft amendment for term limits, and it is my proposal, and I will attempt to move forward a term limits amendment, but it covers not just elected officials. My amendment covers the elected officials, the House and the Senate, and it limits them to 12 years in office, be that up to 4 terms in the House of Representatives, 3 terms in the House of Representatives and 1 term in the Senate, or 2 terms in the Senate. And then they're done. They go home. It also eliminates a retirement for Congress. Says they get paid while they're there and they go home.
Yeah.
Now my amendment goes further because it also puts in term limits for appointed officials. Right now, the president appoints about 1,000 officials in the government, from ambassadors down to secretaries, down to undersecretaries and deputy undersecretaries, and just a whole host of different levels of management within the government. Well, my amendment also limits those people to 12 years in government. And it further limits them to 8 years in any one federal department. Now, I chose those numbers because it allows the president to bring in a Secretary of State, and he's already term limited to 2 terms, but it allows him to have that Secretary of State for his entire 2 terms, if that's what he wants. But that person doesn't get to stay. And at the secretary level, that may not be as big an issue. But when you start getting to all these deputy undersecretaries and what have you, that's your entrenched, or part of your entrenched professional government. The third piece of my amendment, it also goes down to the civil service. And it limits those people to 12 years in the federal government. Now, I make 3 exceptions for government employees there. The first one is for the uniformed members of the armed forces. The second one is for the clandestine officers of the Central Intelligence Agency, whatever that happens to be named under potentially revised government, and for the protection division of the Secret Service. That's the folks that guard the president, what have you. Those 3 groups of people have such unique skills, training, and duties that they're not interchangeable on a regular basis with the citizens, the common citizens of the country. So that needs to be set aside. But everything else that government is involved in, there is a civilian equivalent or a non-government equivalent of that function. So this returns us back to the founders' idea of the citizen legislature, the citizen employee. That you go to government and you do something for a few short years and then you go home.
I always wonder, why do you think that they didn't build that into the system, term limits?
I don't think that the founders, you've got to remember where the country was at that time. And I don't think they ever really envisioned what the country would become down the road in size and scope. And certainly if you read the early documents, there was an understanding of the adverse amendment that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and they recognize that, and that's why many of the pieces of our Constitution are the way they are. But I don't think that they really had the grasp of where technology and all these other things would go that would create government to where we are today. If you read the Federalist Papers, over and over again, they argue, no, we'll never. This won't happen.
And so you're proposing. So your men would say all federal employees, a limit on that, whatever it is that post office too, stuff like that, like if, or what?
Oh, that's a great question.
Yeah, because I've heard the term limit proposed, but most people think for Congress and stuff like that, kind of like the top positions everybody thinks of, but
most of them have been just Congress, yes.
Yeah.
And I believe Madison Cawthorn recently, I'm not sure where he picked up the idea from. That actually comes from a paper I did for School and Liberty University. There's a couple of organizations. You bring up one, the postal system. There's another one, TVA. So let's take those two for a second. The postal system at this point, when the country was founded, was there a need for the government to do that? Possibly so. We've long outgrown that. We've got FedEx, we've got DHL, we've got UPS today that can all do the same function. In fact, they do most of the same function already. There's a tiny little piece of that they're not allowed to do by federal law. Privatize the post office. Two things happen. One, the post office is self-sufficient. Mm-hmm. It always requires additional tax monies in addition to what it gets from the sales of its service.
Yeah. Why is that? Why, you've got these giant multinationals, UPS, like you said, FedEx. They seem to run okay.
They make a profit,
right? Is it because they're able to tap in though to the equity markets to be able to raise the capital that they need, where like a post office can't? I guess it doesn't matter because, like you said, if you remove the post office, something else can come in and
privatize it.
Yeah.
Well, whether it's through a government auction to various companies that somebody's going to buy the post office in whole, or you break it up, how that's done, there can be a lot of debate on, and people can arrive at what's the best way to do that, but it shouldn't be federalized any longer. It should be privatized. TVA is a power company. It was created almost 100 years ago, not quite, to bring power to the Tennessee Valley, a very poor portion of the country at the time. But they operate a number of hydro plants, a number of fossil fuel plants, 3 huge nuclear stations, Wattsbar, Sequoia, and Browns Ferry down in Alabama. Well, I think it's long past time to privatize TVA. And once again, whether you have a sale of it to the private market as a singular entity, or whether you take the pieces and sell off the pieces to existing utilities or companies that are interested in starting a utility, we can have debate on that, what's the best way to move forward to do that. But the federal government has no business in the power production mode. That's private enterprise. Should be private enterprise.
What do you say to people who are like it seems we need, because I've heard these things talked about, for probably a long time. I think people in government are afraid to kind of go forward with these bigger ideas, I think, because they're it's a lot of change. People tend to just generally, they don't like change. They get nervous about it. It scares them for whatever reason. What do you say to people about stuff like that? You say, you want to get rid of the Department of Education, privatize the post office. People freak out, right? You want to privatize the post office when they probably don't even care. They don't even use the post office. They use UPS anyway, right? But what do you say to people to kind of sell that idea to them, or calm their nerves, or just make them not scared about things like that?
Well, what I think the people have to understand is there's nothing that government does that private industry doesn't do better, with one exception, and that's fighting wars. Because only governments have the ability, the money, and there is no profit mechanism in fighting wars. Mm-hmm. So there's no private entity that can take that on. But everything else, most everything else, private enterprise can do better. So you end up with a better product at the end of the day. And seeing the post office go away is, in my mind's eye, no different than when we saw a Ma Bell get broken up and go away. At the time there was honest panic among people that they make sure we got phones all across the country we can talk. You break this up and it's going to be a bunch of different companies. We're not going to be able to talk to each other. And none of that happened. We broke it up. They became different companies. And you look today, most of that's been replaced by all new companies. Verizon and Sprint. And, so there's nothing to fear. Sure, some people will have it, but...
So there's historical precedent that people
Sure.
can look back, and it's just people get stuck in their life now, right? And
Right.
not kind of look back at history and see things like that have been done before. They can be done again. They just need to have the political will has to be there, right? And then that's the best way to actually accomplish it.
And there's communications experts out there that can help with the message to the common folks out there.
Yeah. Another question that so when I told people I'd be interviewing you, or that we'd be having this talk, not necessarily interview, but different questions came up. But one that a lot of people asked were a lot of concerned moms.
Okay.
So concerned moms were they wanted me to ask about your thoughts on what's going on. I know recently in the news there's been that what do you call it? There's like the sports, right? Having transgender women in women's sports, and they have a big problem with that, which I didn't really understand the perspective until they explained it to me, where they're upset, like, hey, you've got these men competing in women's sports, and I'm like, okay, well, what's the big deal, right? Is it really a big deal to them? They say that they see this kind of placed out in popular culture that someone can just say they're a woman without going through recognizing all these things that women deal with all the time for breastfeeding, right? A mom who has to breastfeed has to get up in the middle of the night or pump or do these things. Women have to deal with all their issues that they have to deal with. It's tough, and they feel the sense I got was that they feel very upset and kind of cheated, and they really don't like this, that they see these men being placed as what women should be. They're the woman of the year is this girl who won all these state swimming races or something like that, right? So they wanted to know your thoughts on that going into Congress.
Well, I haven't been asked that question before, but I have commented on the issue. So let's be clear. Men have no business competing in women's sports. Look, I know we have a new woke society, but the fact of the matter is genetics determines what you are, man or woman. And men and women, the chromosomes are different. We are built differently. Our bone structure is different. Our musculature is different. Men are, sure, there's small men, there's big men, but men as a whole versus women as a whole. Men are larger, heavier, and they have a greater percentage of muscle mass as compared to women. Our bodies were designed for different purposes. So men should not be competing in most sports with women. There may be one or two out there that it is reasonable that they compete together. Table tennis. That not particularly advantage being a man or a woman. But for most sports, there's no business there. Now, there's another piece of me that's a little bit almost step out on the edge here, because in some regards, the women's movement has brought this on themselves. They made an unholy alliance with the LGBTQ movement for mutual support when they were warned ahead of time what this all means, but they wanted that mutual support for their agenda. Well, now that whole thing has come full circle, and they're seeing they're reaping the.
So you've seen that evolution across decades now.
Yes.
Where yeah. And I'm sure a lot of people who have lived through that can see that for a lot of different things, right?
It doesn't make it right that they're there, but okay, now you're going to have to unwind it, and it means unwinding a lot more than simply men competing in women's sports.
Yeah. And when you get into Congress, so you say you get into Congress, you start getting these TV interviews on kind of like normal big time corporate media, local. It seems like I could just envision a future interview, and you have this same type of question, and then he's trying to make you look stupid just from having that opinion. How do you handle that type of situation? That seems to be a big part of being in Congress. Is the media, dealing with media, and kind of how you're not able to choose how you're portrayed to a great degree. So that I feel like that's a very difficult thing to have to deal with.
Yeah. So I haven't had to deal with that in the past. I know what my positions are, and I can state my positions. And I watch all the time where the media portrays people as something other than what they are. You just got to have thick skin. You accept the fact that the media is not going to always be fair, is not going to be honest. I think there's very little question today that most of what we used to know as the mainstream media operates as nothing more than the propaganda arm of the Democratic Party. I can't really tell you why. I have some beliefs on what happened, but I don't have the proofs to put out there why that change occurred. So, but all I can do is be myself with the media and not worry about how it's portrayed. The people that support me, that come see me, will get the truth and understand exactly what I stand for. And I think one of the things that I'll be rolling out here in the next series of speeches that I do to the groups around the district is one of the commitments. I've been working with some other people I can't name yet because just a lot of politics. But one of the things that I will commit to if I am elected by the people of the 10th district is I will commit to a monthly town hall. We have 6 full counties and 2 partial counties in the district. The partial counties are close enough to the borders of the other large cities in the other counties that what I will do is I will hold a monthly town hall in the 6 full counties. So that would be one.
So you'll travel to the different.
I'll do one. And when I talked with somebody else as we were kind of working out how this might happen, how it might be put in place without hurting anybody's opinion. What I said we would do is we'll do one a month, every month, and we'll do it alphabetically. So in January we would hit Alexander County. February we would hit Burke County. March we would hit Catawba County. April we would hit Cleveland County. May we would hit Iredell County. June we'd hit Lincoln County, and then we'd just start the circuit all over again. So once a month for every citizen of the county. And of course Caldwell County, there's just a small piece there. I think 2 precincts is all that's in the 10th district. They're close enough to either Burke or Catawba that they could easily, I imagine Catawba, that would normally happen in, say, Hickory. Mm-hmm. Iredell probably would normally happen in Statesville. I would probably try and rotate between Lincolnton and Denver in Lincoln County, but there's places close enough so that everybody can come. And I represent, if I'm elected, I represent all the people. I may be a conservative and I have conservative values and that's the way I will vote, but I still would represent everybody. So Democrat wants to come and they want to make a point, come and make your point. Be courteous, but make your point.
Yeah, so you want to, and that's one thing I've noticed, you're going to a lot of the different local events and everything like that during this campaign. I don't know that I've seen all the candidates do that, because there's, 4 or 5 running for District 10 right now?
There are 5 candidates in the race for District 10 right now, yes.
Okay, so yeah, if elected, you want to have that, a regular connection with the people in the district where they can come and they can ask questions of you and you can hear from them and kind of keep that connection constant between you and the people you represent.
That's correct, and I'm making that commitment right here. This is the first time it's being publicly heard. It's been privately heard as I've worked out some issues with other folks to try and work messages out. So I think one more thing I need to get on the table. I said there were 3 things that I would absolutely promise. So we covered fighting to get rid of the Department of Education. We covered subsidies. The third thing I won't vote for any bills that have mandates in them. Mandates are simply the government bribing you to do X, Y, or Z because they can't make a law to force you to do X, Y, or Z. So we can't, we go back to I think about years ago we wanted a 55 mile an hour speed limit. This would have been back in the 70s. Well, we couldn't make that a law. We didn't have the constitutional authority to make that a law. But what we did is we said, well, if you don't adopt 55 mile an hour speed limit, we won't give you these highway funds. Yeah. So 49 of the 50 states fell in line to adopt the 55. They wanted to change the drinking age across the entire country to 21. Right. How do we do that? Once again, we go back to highway funds. You don't have to. We can't make you as a state do that. We can't do that as a federal government. But if you don't do it, we won't give you these highway funds. And so much of things, it's through these mandates that are clearly unconstitutional.
And it's because the states nowadays are largely relying on this central government, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we've got to turn that back around and get the federal government in its lane where it belongs and return the power to the states and to the people.
Well, we're probably coming up on time. How much?
This would be 53 minutes.
Okay. So yes, let's wrap it up. But
okay.
Yeah, I wanted also, before we end, I wanted people to kind of get an idea of like we're here in your home, and you've got the portrait of Washington. This isn't like a setup, like you didn't just set this up here just so we could come. You've got the Reagan, memorial here, portrait. You've got all these really cool carvings of Air Force planes and things like that. And just, I don't know if we talked about your background in the military and kind of just your background, your family, stuff like that people can get a better idea for you that Sure. I was able to kind of get being here.
So I was born into a military family. Dad was in the Air Force, and we traveled around when I was a child.
Yes, so did I.
my childhood, I never lived in one place for 3 years. When I was going to high school, my senior year, in fact, I went to 3 different high schools, but my senior year, I knew I wasn't going to college. It just was not in the cards. And this recruiter came into the school with this film on airborne school. And I knew right then that I was going to be a paratrooper. So I went down my senior year, and I signed up to join the Army. Now, I was told I could have any job in the world, any job in the Army, as far as enlisted man. And this recruiter just couldn't understand why I wanted to be in the infantry, but that's where I ended up. That's what I was after. So I spent the first almost 10 years of my career as a paratrooper in the 82nd Airborne Division as an infantryman. And I got involved in skydiving and free fall. And I got an assignment over at an organization that provided the air support for the JSOC elements, Joint Special Operations Command. And I spent about a year there and was also involved in testing high altitude, low opening parachutes, the new ones that the Army was going to adopt. From there, I went out to Colorado for a year and then returned a year later to Fort Bragg and spent the remainder of my career in Special Forces. And I just always have had that connection to country, how important that is.
Is that something that kind of goes back in your family? Or
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, very interesting. Do you think, I moved around a lot too when I was a kid. My dad was in the military, and I feel like moving around obviously has its cons, but also its pros, in that you kind of get to deal with a lot of different people and kind of see a lot of different things. I think it does something to you having to move around and not growing up in the same school as a kid with all the same friends and things like that. Did you get that same type of sense?
I do have that sense. You get a more a broader world view rather than just that local view that a lot of people end up with. That they I mean, there's people that are born, live, and die and never leave the county.
Right.
But that military dependency in my term in service, I visited a lot of foreign countries, spent a lot of time, and I visited almost every state in this country while I was in the service. You see a lot of different cultures, and I think that broadens your worldview.
Yeah, that's really helpful and probably very important in being in Congress. I would imagine you have to deal with a lot of different people from a lot of different places. Yeah, well, best of luck to you. Thank you for doing this. I appreciate it, and I hope a lot of people get to see it and kind of get an idea for what it is you want to do. Again, your website was great, and I thought maybe you were a lawyer. Honestly, from everything written on the website and the documents and everything. So maybe people will be surprised. I didn't go to college. I was in the Army for all these years. I was impressed, and it's great meeting you, and thank you again.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.